The laughter came fast and mean, the kind that fills a room before anyone thinks to stop it. Renata Hollis stood at the front of the boardroom on the 32nd floor of the Alderton Financial Tower, her jaw tight, her hands flat on the table. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Calgary stretched gray and cold under a February sky. Inside, 12 people in expensive clothes were trying very hard not to look at the man pushing the cleaning cart through the door. He had knocked. That was the thing nobody mentioned afterward. He had knocked and waited and knocked again before entering. The cart's left wheel had a slow squeak. Every person in that room heard it. His name was Frank Okafor. He was 53 years old. He wore a navy uniform that had been washed so many times the color had gone thin at the elbows, and steel-toed boots with a crack running along the left toe. He had a face that didn't give much away, the kind that comes from years of learning, which expressions cost you something. He looked at the room, clocked the tension, and began quietly emptying the waste bins along the far wall. At the head of the table, Renata Hollis, CEO of Hollis Capital Advisors, 47 years old, the kind of woman who used silence as a weapon, glanced at her legal counsel and then at the delegation from Nakamura and Seki seated across from her. 3 men in dark suits, their documents spread before them, their expressions carefully neutral. The contract had arrived from the Tokyo office 4 days ago. 41 pages, dense with clauses. Renata had passed it to her legal team. Her legal team had passed it to an outside firm. The outside firm had returned it with a translation that her own staff described, quietly, as technically fine but something feels off. The deal was worth $230 million. Renata had spent 40 minutes that morning telling her CFO, Lawrence, that she felt fine about it. She had spent the last 20 minutes sitting across from Kenji Nakamura and feeling less and less fine. The problem was not the language. The problem was the clause on page 31, subsection C, which her lawyers had translated as a standard performance review mechanism and which Kenji Nakamura had just referred to, in passing and with almost no emphasis, as a recalibration trigger. These were not the same thing. Renata knew they were not the same thing. She did not know what the difference was, specifically in Japanese legal terms, and she could not ask without revealing that she did not know. "Shall we proceed to signatures?" Kenji asked. His English was perfect, his tone was courteous, his expression gave away nothing. Renata's assistant, a young woman named Priya, shifted in her seat. The outside lawyer coughed. Lawrence looked at his phone. That was when Renata's gaze drifted to the man with the cleaning cart. She said it before she thought it through. Do you speak Japanese?" The room went quiet in a specific way. The kind of quiet that has an edge to it. Frank had his back to her. He straightened slowly, holding a bin liner. He turned around. He looked at her with that same unreading expression. "Some," he said. There was a beat. Then the laughter started, not from Kenji's side of the table, to their credit. It came from Lawrence, a short exhale through the nose. From the outside lawyer, who covered it with a cough. From 2 of Renata's senior analysts who had been in the room since 9 that morning, and were tired and a little careless. Renata heard the laughter and felt something she would later describe as shame, though in the moment she told herself it was just irritation. I didn't mean," she started. "What kind of Japanese?" Kenji asked. Everyone looked at him. His tone had not changed. He was looking at Frank with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. Frank set the bin liner down. "Legal and financial mostly. Some medical." He paused. "I spent 12 years at the Ministry of Finance in Lagos on a joint regulatory exchange with the JFSA. Most of the documentation we processed came through in Japanese." The laughter, which had already been fading, stopped entirely. Kenji said something to the man beside him, in Japanese, quickly and low. The man's eyebrows moved. Renata looked at Frank. Frank looked at Renata. He did not look offended. He did not look satisfied. He looked, if anything, like a man who had had this particular moment before and had learned not to expect it to go one way or the other. "The contract," Renata said after a moment. "Page 31. Frank walked to the table. Someone slid the document toward him. He picked it up. He read. The room watched him the way you watch someone diffuse something. He read for 3 minutes without speaking. His lips didn't move. He turned back to page 22, read for another 30 seconds, then turned forward again. "The translation your firm provided isn't wrong," he said, "but it's incomplete." He set the document down on the table and pointed to a line of Japanese text. "This phrase, here, The word used is Itatser Toriga, recalibration trigger, which in standard commercial translation becomes performance review mechanism. That's technically accurate. But in Japanese financial law, this specific phrasing carries a secondary implication that your translation doesn't reflect. He looked up. Under this clause, if Hollis Capital's average quarterly return falls below 12% over any 18-month period, Nakamura and SEC gained the right to appoint 2 board observers with full document access. The clause doesn't call them board members. It calls them kanchaja, observers. But the access rights attached to the observer role, which are defined separately on page 38, include the right to review all proprietary investment models and strategy documents upon request. The room held very still. That's not a performance review, Frank said. That's a conditional intelligence access agreement. Kenji Nakamura looked at his document, then at Frank, then at Renata. Accurate, he said simply. Renata sat back in her chair. The outside lawyer had his pen in his hand and was not writing anything. Lawrence was no longer looking at his phone. "Why is it phrased this way?" Renata asked. She wasn't sure who she was asking. Frank was still standing at the table. He hadn't sat down. Nobody had invited him to. The phrasing follows a pattern that's common in certain Tokyo-originated cross-border agreements negotiated in the late 2000s, he said. It came out of a period when a number of international firms were raising concerns about post-2008 exposure, and Japanese financial institutions were cautious about transparency obligations. The language is designed to protect their position without explicitly stating the rights they're acquiring. A Canadian firm reviewing it with a standard commercial translation service wouldn't necessarily flag it. Kenji looked at him for a moment. "You said Lagos," he said. "Yes, regulatory exchange. 12 years, as I said, and now you're—" Kenji looked at the cleaning cart, then back at Frank. "Building maintenance," Frank said. "I moved to Calgary 8 years ago when my daughter started her residency at Foothills. She had a complicated pregnancy 2 years in. Stayed." He said it without self-pity, without performance. Just the facts of a life, arranged in the order they had happened. "The work is steady." There was a silence. Renata broke it. "Would you be willing to go through the rest of the document?" Frank looked at her, then at the clock on the wall, then at his cart. "I have the north and west corridors left," he said, "and the 4th-floor washrooms. I'll have someone cover them." He considered this. "All right," he said. He sat down at the table. Not at the end, not in the middle, but in the nearest open chair, which happened to be between Lawrence and the outside lawyer, both of whom shifted almost imperceptibly to give him room. He pulled the contract toward him. He began to read from page 1. What happened over the next 2 hours was the kind of thing that people talk about differently, depending on who they were in the room. The outside lawyer later described it as a thorough secondary review. Lawrence described it as Frank walking us through some nuances. Renata, when she told the story, and she would tell it, eventually with some precision, called it what it was, a man reading a document and telling her the truth about it. There were 6 clauses Frank flagged. 3 were minor, imprecise language that would not have caused problems, but would have left certain terms open to interpretation in Hollis Capital's disfavor. 2 were moderate, a dispute resolution clause that routed arbitration to a Tokyo tribunal rather than the ICC, and a payment timing clause that, on close reading, effectively gave Nakamura and Seki a 60-day float on every quarterly payment. The 6th was the significant one. On page 37, buried in a subsection about operational coordination protocols, there was a clause that granted Nakamura and Seki the right to conduct what the document called Dingti Tekina Gyomu Pinka, periodic operational evaluations. The English translation provided by Renata's outside firm had rendered this as scheduled operational reviews, which sounded routine. Frank read the attached definition on page 39, cross-referenced a phrase on page 12, and explained quietly that the scope of these evaluations, as defined within the document itself, was broad enough to include access to client account structures. Not client data, he clarified, when he saw Renata's expression. The structures. The architecture of how the accounts are categorized and managed. That's still sensitive. If you're operating in sectors where your competitors would pay for structural intelligence, this clause gives them a legal framework to obtain it. Kenji was very still. "We are prepared," Kenji said, "to remove that subsection." It was the first time he had offered to remove anything. Renata looked at him. "And the observer clause?" A pause. We can revise the access rights attached to the observer role. To exclude proprietary model documentation, yes, and route arbitration to the ICC. A longer pause. Yes. Renata looked at Frank. Frank had his hand flat on the document. He was not looking at anyone. He was reading something on page 26. There's one more thing, he said. Everyone waited. Page 26, the currency conversion protocol. The exchange rate benchmark is defined as the Tokyo close, not the Bank of Canada rate. On a deal this size over a multi-year term, the spread compounds. He looked up. It's not a trap. I think it's just an oversight, but it should be fixed. Kenji looked at the page. He said something to his colleague in Japanese. His colleague said something back. Kenji nodded. Oversight, he confirmed. We'll correct it. Renata picked up her pen. She set it back down. She looked at Frank, who had closed the contract and was sitting with his hands on the table, waiting to be told what happened next. Where did you say you worked before? She said. I didn't, Frank said. You asked if I spoke Japanese. It wasn't unkind. It was just accurate. Renata was quiet for a moment. Ministry of Finance. Lagos. The JFSA exchange. That's right. What did you do there? I was a deputy director, Frank said. Cross-border regulatory compliance. We reviewed joint investment frameworks between Nigerian, Japanese, and EU financial institutions. Most of the disputed documentation came through our office. Deputy director. At the time, yes. Lawrence was staring at the table. The outside lawyer had closed his portfolio. And you've been doing building maintenance for 8 years, Frank said. My daughter needed me. The hospital is 3 blocks from this building. When she has a long shift, I pick up her boys from school. He paused. The work is close. The hours work. That's all. Renata heard that the way you hear something that reorganizes what you thought you understood. She had built a company from a $40,000 personal loan and 20 years of decisions, many of them good, some of them fortunate, a few of them things she didn't talk about. She knew what it was to do what the situation required. She had just never applied that understanding to the man pushing the cleaning cart. I'd like to offer you a consulting role, she said, for this contract review and anything that comes through in Japanese or related regulatory frameworks. Frank looked at her. I have a job, he said. This would be an addition. I don't need more money. Renata paused. I don't know that that's true. It is, Frank said. He said it without embarrassment. My daughter finished her residency. She's a staff physician now. Her boys are healthy. My expenses are modest. I work because I like being useful and because the building superintendent is a good man who has never once talked to me like I was invisible. He let that land where it landed. I'm not looking to be rescued, Miss Hollis. I came in to empty your bins. The room was quiet. Kenji Nakamura, who had been watching this exchange with an expression that had moved, gradually, from neutrality to something closer to respect, folded his hands on the table. Perhaps, he said to Renata, the right question is not what you can offer him. Perhaps the right question is what he is willing to give. Renata looked at Kenji, then at Frank. Frank considered the ceiling for a moment, as though he were checking a calendar only he could see. I'm in this building, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, he said. If something comes across your desk that needs a second pair of eyes, a real second pair, not a rubber stamp, you can leave it at the front desk with my name on it. I'll look at it when I'm here. He paused. I won't sign anything, I won't sit in on meetings, and I won't charge you. I can't accept that, Renata said. You don't have to accept it, Frank said. That's the offer. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in his face she recognized, though she could not immediately name it. Later she would understand it as the particular calm of a person who has nothing to prove, because they've already proved it to the only audience that mattered to them, themselves and the people they loved. All right, she said. Frank pushed his chair back and stood. He picked up his bin liner from where he had set it by the wall. He looked at Kenji. The contract is fixable, he said. The changes we discussed are reasonable on both sides. I think you both want the deal to work. I think it will. Kenji inclined his head. It was a small gesture, but it was genuine. Frank walked back to his cart. The left wheel squeaked on the way out. Nobody laughed this time. In the months that followed, Renata did leave documents at the front desk. Not often. 3 times in the first year, twice in the second. Each time she came in on the following Wednesday or Friday, there was an envelope waiting for her in return, the pages inside annotated in small, even handwriting, never more than was needed. Never less. She raised the issue of compensation with Frank 4 times. He declined 4 times. On the 5th occasion, she stopped raising it because she understood finally that he was not being modest and he was not performing humility. He had simply made the calculation that mattered to him and arrived at a number she couldn't change. The Nakamura and Seki deal closed in April. The revised contract was, by the assessment of 2 independent legal reviewers, clean. The recalibration clause was removed. The arbitration routing was corrected. The currency benchmark was amended to a weighted average of the Bank of Canada rate and the Tokyo close, which Frank had suggested and which both sides found fair. The deal performed. Both parties renewed 3 years later under new terms negotiated without incident. Frank Okafor kept his route: Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Fridays, north and west corridors, 4th floor washrooms. He retired from Alderton Financial Tower 4 years after the meeting in the boardroom when his eldest grandson started at the University of Calgary, and Frank decided it was time to be available for things other than work. At his retirement, the building superintendent organized a small gathering in the lobby. Frank's daughter came, and both grandsons, and 3 of the tenants who had made a point of learning his name over the years. Renata Hollis came down from the 32nd floor. She brought a card signed by her whole team. She did not make a speech. She shook his hand and held it for a moment longer than a handshake requires. "You changed the outcome of that deal," she said. Frank looked at her with the same expression he had worn in the boardroom 4 years earlier, steady, unrevealing, a little tired in the way that people who have done real work are always a little tired. "You would have caught it," he said. He was being kind. She knew he was being kind. She let him be kind. He picked up the retirement card and walked out into the February cold where his daughter was waiting with the car running. And that was that.